many other flashpoints in the country. Nasser is just one of the latest that we have seen since the beginning of the year. What we're witnessing in Nasser has had a devastating impact on civilians because since conflict there renewed in mid-February, thousands of civilians fled their homes and are in desperate conditions without access to health, without food, without access to drinking water. Nasser, Upper Nile, and much of South Sudan has been facing a humanitarian crisis, including a cholera outbreak. So if this situation continues, the consequences for civilians will be quite dire. But even then, at the beginning in February, we saw the use of heavy weaponry, artillery, heavy weaponry, mortar shells, and including airstrikes on the government said it was at IO positions, but also civilian areas were hit. And I think about 10 civilians were killed. I think a UN peacekeeper was injured in mid-February. And also last week, 2 UN staffers, along with many others, lost their lives. So Nasser is just one issue right now in South Sudan, but there are other areas of concern, including Western Equatoria, where in the last many weeks there have been clashes that have displaced thousands of civilians from their homes. There's also other areas, including southern central Equatoria, where the government has continued a counterinsurgency campaign with the National Salvation Front, which is not party to the peace deal. So there is significant concern that this latest flashpoints might lead to if it is not handled well, if there's no de-escalation, that the consequences, especially in this situation where South Sudan has been moving from one emergency to another in a very unstable region, that the situation could escalate for civilians.
Alan Niagwa there just gave us quite a good summary of the flashpoints around the country. In addition to that, arrests taking place in the capital, Juba. You heard the UN Special Representative Nicholas Haysom saying both sides are responsible. How do you see it? Who is responsible for the current spark in violence?
Well, you can talk about both sides in South Sudan, but as you also mentioned in your interview with Haysom, the other major player here is the war in Sudan, if you can call it a player as well. So I think, this power-sharing government in South Sudan has always had a lot of problems. There's been ongoing tension. The first vice president, who was previously the rebel leader, Riek Machar, he's surrounded by President Kiir's forces in Juba, which is obviously a tense situation as it is. So we've had lots of escalation at various points within the past few years. I think what makes this time different is the amount of pressure the war on Sudan is putting on the political system on South Sudan, both in terms of a lost revenue, but also in terms of the conflict itself, which is now very much raging on South Sudan's border, and a very polarized regional environment in which you have some countries supporting one side, some countries the other, and it's just getting very difficult for South Sudan, which is very fragile, very weak, has all these fissures within it. It's getting what we're really worried about is basically if you have a political crisis, you have a security crisis, that this could merge with the war in Sudan and grow quite big.
Niagwa, can you take up that point about the war in the much bigger northern neighbour? There seem to be two things there. The double refugees. Some had fled to Sudan from South Sudan. They're coming back again, and other refugees coming from Sudan, and also the economy and the shutting down of it's not operating anyway, of the oil pipeline.
Well, the first is because we have over 1 million people that have fled the Sudan war into South Sudan. And this, since 2023, has really exacerbated, or it has created a huge stress on the humanitarian sector in South Sudan. Those who are coming to South Sudan, majority of them are South Sudanese returnees who have fled multiple times. They fled South Sudan for Sudan, and many then had to flee back. But there are also many Sudanese who have fled to South Sudan, and have also moved to other parts in the region, and so we're seeing that the conflict in Sudan, which Human Rights Watch, has been documenting since the beginning, and Human Rights Watch has been calling for a protection of civilian mandates, as well as for the arms embargo in Darfur to be extended across the whole country. And so if the conflict in Sudan is not addressed, Sudan and South Sudan, despite the separation, have continued to be attached at the hip because of many issues, socially, politically, and economically. And so it is not a wild guess that as the conflict in Sudan continues, and it also makes the borders porous, the possibility of arms flowing between the two countries very easy as well. So it creates a much more tense situation in South Sudan. And now what we're seeing, what's also very concerning and, reminds us of events of 2013 and the early period of South Sudan's war, is the arrest of key opposition leaders and the threat by the security service to continue this arrest. And so, in spite of the fact that the president has urged for calm, if these arrests continue and the detention of key leaders continues, arbitrary detentions without charge, without due process, then this in itself is a worrying point.
Alan, I believe you were a journalist 14 years ago at the time of independence and covered the situation in South Sudan. I mean, it was a very upbeat picture, wasn't it, at the time? This is a country with oil riches. It has timber, minerals. It has livestock it can export. What's gone wrong?
Well, you need more than oil revenue to build a country, I would say. And in fact, having oil revenue when you haven't decided how to share that oil revenue or have any institutions to manage it might actually make the thing worse. So I think, like you said, I was around at the time. I tried asking a lot of these questions, saying, how are we so sure this will go right? There's a lot of signs it'll go very wrongly. And what I found at the time is that people basically had overconfidence that we know how to build a nation, that we know how to build a state. And I think some of that filtered down to South Sudanese elite, unfortunately, where they felt like, with the international support they were going, that, that they didn't have to think too seriously about some of these matters and could, meanwhile, they just fell into civil war instead. And they basically had a scramble, a sort of king of the hill scramble for controlling this oil revenue. And now many people call South Sudan the most corrupt country on the planet, which is what happens when you have a giant pot of oil money, no institutions, and no political settlement about how to govern the country. So I think there's a lot of blame to be shared among many. I also think, frankly, something like this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, where there's, is an era in which people still believed in nation building and state building to a degree that I think, now is no longer there.
Niagwa, if we look at it, of course, after independence, South Sudan became a completely separate country, but there is, it seems, a little bit of a sad symmetry between what has happened in Sudan and South Sudan. Certainly in Sudan, a war that's tied very much to two men. Let me ask you about the situation in South Sudan. How much does it come down to these two leaders?
Well, given that they have dominated the political scene, the two leaders are not the only signatories to the peace deal. They're not the only stakeholders to the peace agreement. We also forget that civil society, women leaders, academics all oversaw the signing of this peace agreement. And while we tend to focus on the two main principles who have shaped the political scene of South Sudan for, since 2005, after the death of John Garang. There are also a lot of other stakeholders involved, the African Union, the UN, IGAD, and various donors and who are involved in this peace process. So it's about holding these processes to these individuals to account, but also about ensuring that certain mechanisms that have been put in place, such as an arms embargo, such as sanctions and travel bans, that the region, implements some of these mechanisms that have been put in place, and that there are processes towards ensuring accountability for the many horrendous, horrific crimes that we have documented and many others have documented since conflict broke out in 2013. So at the end of the day, yes, Machar and Kiir and President Kiir seem to be the two people that hold much of the influence in South Sudan. But as many civil society activists will tell you, the country is bigger and the future belongs to many South Sudanese.
Nyagwa, just to be clear, though, on that point you were making about crimes being committed and these being the two men who've been in charge and have been feuding against each other for so long, what's the position of Human Rights Watch? Should these two men actually be facing charges?
Because human rights abuses, serious crimes have been committed where there is command